seems like a problem that's not really there.
It's because I think because they were organized under the private housing finance law as an HDFC, and because of the statutory provisions, I actually feel like the way the corporate structure is, it doesn't allow a pathway out as it's currently formed.
Is that your opinion, or do you have like is there a determination that the city made about that?
I've heard this numerous times over the last 25 years from both the AG and the HPD, and like I've not asked for a formal opinion, but when my conversations with them that I've been involved in, that's what they continue to tell me. So if you think a formal opinion is better than trying to do a statutory change that clarifies as a pathway out, that's an interesting concept, but I actually feel like it'd be better to have a written pathway out, so buildings could, if they wanted to get out of the program, they could actually have a pathway to get out of the program.
Yeah, but it seems like a talking point unless it really is a problem.
Well, when you say it's really a problem, the city takes a position, and I know the AGs take a position, that they were incorporated under the private housing finance law, and that they're governed under Article 11, and specifically, 6-to-1 maintenance for persons of low income. Those are real statutory provisions that exist, and if you're governed by those statutory provisions, that's what the law says. So I'm not sure why you think that just because the damn tax cap would expire, those statutory provisions, which are the basis for the certificate of incorporation, no longer apply.
Isn't that a question that could be settled without new legislation? It could be settled in court.
Yeah.
So every building has to go to court?
No, but maybe one or two court cases would settle the issue, or at least settle
I mean, I think that's a decision that people can make. I think it's a smarter choice.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We need to get to another point.
Yeah, we need to move on. You speak into the mic, please.
Okay, I don't know if there are other buildings like ours, but when we incorporated in 1980 under this law, our agreement says that our agreement expires in 10 years. That means it expired in 1990. Why are we being subjected to this if our agreement says this agreement expires in 10 years?
Right.
So, but we're here and we're still discussing this and the pathway to get out. Like maybe because I heard the other lady saying, why don't we just get out of it when it expires? Well, ours has been expired since the 1990. So where do we stand? So I think you need to look maybe into the very old ones that are incorporated in 80 or at the very beginning. I think we were the first building. I'm not sure, but I almost believe that we are the first building that incorporated in HDFC with that sentence.
Yeah, I think probably
So
HPD.
as it expires, it should be expired. I shouldn't be here still worrying about what's going to happen with the dam, with this and with that.
So part of that's the reason I want to clarify that, because if people want to be out, we shouldn't have this threat hanging over some buildings' heads saying, well, we're not sure you're really ever going to get out because your certificate of incorporation and how you incorporated in the application to the Attorney General's office said you were for persons of low income. If people want to get out, I think we need a clear pathway out. And doesn't mean I'm right, but this is my understanding, and I think I'm right because, 3 years ago, HPD sent a letter to probably, maybe 5 years ago saying, these are the rules you have to operate under because you're under this program. Like if we don't want HPD to if people don't want to be operating under that program, then we need to make sure there's a pathway that HPD is clear that they don't have oversight anymore.
Okay, I also have a list of questions here, so I'm gonna alternate between these questions and the audience. The first question I have here, you had an HDFC roundtable last year where you invited representatives from different groups to talk about changing the private housing finance law and re-regulating HDFCs. Attendees were HPD, UHAB, the New York State Attorney General's Office, Legal Aid, Attorney Erica Buckley of Nixon Peabody, Attorney from Goldstein and Hall, Chair of Housing Committee in State Assembly Stephen Simrowitz, Chair of Housing Committee in State Assembly Brian Kavanaugh, some nonprofit housing groups with HDFC rentals, but no HDFC co-ops. Why did you not go to HDFC co-op shareholders to include them to find out what they wanted before you drafted a bill?
Well, I'd say first, we did talk to a lot of HDFC co-ops because not only do I live in the neighborhood and I've lived for decades, I've talked to lots of shareholders. We had a lot of conversations with people before drafting a draft bill that we can introduce. And whether they, should have been at the round table, I'm not sure timing or how it worked out. I think we had an initial date that I think they were invited to, then it was canceled because the Women's League won the soccer thing and we had to cancel it. So probably a mistake on my office that they weren't at that second adjourned meeting. And when I sat down, I think the meeting was in September, and then I sat down with the coalition soon thereafter. So could have done a better job, 100%, but I think we've been on constant communication, and if we didn't want people to be involved, we wouldn't have met the people, drafted a bill, we met with them, not introduced it, because we still were talking to people, and had numerous conversations along the way. If our position was we didn't want shareholder involvement, you could just introduce a bill and never meet with anybody. Our goal was really to be an iterative process where we're doing a lot of back and forth.
Well, I mean, I have to point out, it is fairly standard operating procedure that things are presented without HDFC shareholder input, such as the HPD regulatory agreement that they wanted to pass, the Betty Little bill, which your bill has a lot of similarities to. We're never consulted. It's like, we're the ones who will be most affected, but we're never consulted in the planning process or the initial creative process.
Well, Lisa, I have to say, if not consulted, I've had numerous meetings with folks, I've had meetings with the coalition, we're still here, and we still haven't introduced a bill. Like, if the process is in an iterative process when you're drafting, that you're bringing interested parties to the table to get feedback, that's exactly what's happening.
Okay, as long as you take it seriously into consideration.
Yeah, and so we met with the coalition, they had some recommendations, as we were drafting, we incorporated those ideas. We still didn't introduce it, even though we met with them and incorporated feedback. We gave them the draft bill, said, give us additional feedback. We want to continue to make edits. And that's what this process is, a back and forth where people engage in a useful dialogue so we can get to the best place possible.
That's great. Again, as long as what is said here tonight and written here tonight actually is taken into consideration rather than to, okay, well, I heard them now, I'm just going to, go ahead with the way I want it to be. But sir, you on the aisle, could you come up to the mic?
Yeah, I can speak real loud. In your current draft legislation, is there a pathway out? Is this young lady? I have not seen this yet.
So there's 4 different bills, and the pathway out idea came up fairly recently in the last 2 months, and so we haven't drafted anything because like I said, it's a collaborative process. So I'm happy to draft something or have our bill drafters draft it and share it with them, but what I've been trying to do is just not move forward without having a dialogue and a back and forth. So I've said this many times, this is what we want to do, and we've heard from shareholders that this is a good idea, and part of what today is, Jackson over there is my legislative director, and he will be the person who will help us get these drafts together. That's why it was important to bring him here, so we can hear directly back from residents as well. Our goal is to do what we just said we were going to do. The only thing, can I just add one thing?
Sure.
The feedback I've gotten, around the distressed buildings and the ombudsman bill, we didn't get a lot of feedback here, but we are planning to move those forward, and we love feedback from folks about those issues. I understand some people think that doesn't affect a lot of buildings in our neighborhood, but that does affect a lot of buildings in our city, and that state law is something that we need to do across this, that has impact across not just our district, but other buildings, and if we save 3 buildings, it'll be worth it. We don't want to lose any buildings.
Can I just finish on that? Because I've been in HDFC for 21 years in this village, and I've never heard from
Can you come to the mic, please?
Sure, and I've never heard once.
Wait, start over again.
Okay, I've been in the East Village in an HDFC for 21 years. I've never once heard from HPD. I've been on the board 15 of 21 years. Herman can testify to that. And I want to know, we only hear about HPD. Is there a representative in this room from HPD? Okay? So everybody, has anyone ever heard from HPD?
Where do you perform your stand-up comedy routine? I want to see you.
This is a serious issue. Okay, we've
I
never
don't know
heard,
that.
we hear about it in the Betty Little bill
Yeah.
tonight, and we all get scared to death that you're coming to take our property. You're obviously a reasonable man. I'm hearing you and I understand it. But I want some clarification on that pathway out, because the catch-22 we always hear is, from every attorney any of us have ever spoken to, is that HPD has to sign off on a pathway out, and HPD will never do that.
Right.
I will say, when our building came out of the 60/40 RA that we had to sign in when we bought our building, literally a week after we were out of it, I got contacted by Hillary Glaus from UHAB, and she wanted us to sign a new RA that was 70/30, and it would have just been another 25 years. And we basically asked her at that point, and we said, well, we've heard rumors that there have been some HDFCs that have left the program. And she literally snorted with amusement. She said, HPD will never allow that.
Right.
So, I'm going to read two statements here.
Can I just respond to that? If I
Please.
Oh, sure, sorry, I thought you had to.
No, so your experiences are, your experiences, and I respect that. But we could create state statutory language that creates a pathway out that doesn't require HPD to sign off on it, right? It doesn't require that. So part of this process is hearing that you don't want HPD to have the authority to sign off. It would probably, whether it would be something that would go to the AG's office, maybe that may make sense, or maybe there's another entity that would, oversee it, maybe it's not HPD, but I think there's got to be some trigger that says you file a letter with the Attorney General saying you want a pathway out, this is how you do it. That might be a process that would make sense. Because it sounds like HPD is not the appropriate place to do it.
You keep saying pathway out, we do not understand what it means. What does it mean?
A pathway out is essentially, supposedly, if an HDFC is no longer governed by a regulatory agreement and they wish to leave the program, it's called the pathway out. From what we have understood from the draft bill, is if you have a building that has 20 units of housing in it, if you wanted to leave the program, and you can tell me if we misread this, the building would have to pay the city an equal amount of what it would cost to build a new building with 20 low-income units in it.
But why would we like to do that?
Is that what the draft bill says?
Why would I do that?
No, I have no idea where that came from. And it's not, we haven't even drafted a bill to talk about a pathway out, and why would we put that burden on HDFCs to do that? Like, I don't know what lawyer said it from what piece of document that they're looking at.
They were looking at your draft bill.
But
If they're wrong, then I
The draft bill
apologize.
doesn't even have a language for pathway out, because it would be a
Okay.
separate freestanding bill.
Okay, then we were given the wrong information.
I just think, I understand there's fear, and I appreciate that, and anxiety, and I know there's been a long history of HPD, sounds like not communicating, but, I'm not.
MIA.
Never communicating, okay, never communicating. That's not what my intent is, that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to have an open dialogue, and I'm here, I come here, I live in the neighborhood, people see me on the street, and it's not like I'm going anywhere.
Yeah, but how do you stand? How do you stand? Are you behind HPD?
Question is, how do you stand? Are you behind HPD?
Yes, are you behind HPD? What is your agenda as far as we're concerned, as far as HDFC is concerned? And we want the truth.
What is your agenda as far as HDFC is concerned? We want the truth.
So I started out the conversation about the 4 areas we thought we wanted to work on. I've never worked for HPD, I've never worked for the city, I don't work for the city now. I got elected to be a state representative because there were lots of issues I care about. I've been doing affordable housing and community activism for decades in this neighborhood. I'm not here to speak or support HPD. And so I don't know when you say, where do you stand? I don't know what 100% what you mean, but I'm not here, I don't speak for HPD and I never will.
Wait, this gentleman has been waiting, let him speak, please.
Instead of drafting a bill, why don't you work with the HDFCs in this area to propose to HPD to stop holding the HDFCs hostage based on ancient articles of incorporation? Each HDFC is its own breathing entity. Each one was developed differently, under different guises, for different purposes, from artists, membership groups to shareholders. You cannot blanket HDFC under one sheet. You need 1,000 sheets, because each one needs its own blanket. Thank you.
So in some ways, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Each building is in a different situation, and the goal here is to do something that allows for a variety of situations. And if the answer that you're suggesting is that we go to HPD and tell them to do nothing, that's a strategy. I think it's a mistake, because I think there are things that we can do to improve HDFCs, and for the ones that need additional support, there's a lot of things we can do. So I think there's a real discussion here about what's appropriate to do to strengthen the buildings that are doing well, what's appropriate to do to the buildings that aren't doing well, and what's appropriate to do with the buildings who really don't want to have this government oversight anymore. And those seem like real categories.